Ladies and gentlemen, today we have a very interesting video, a very interesting teardown of a controller that I never thought I'd have access to because, well, there's not many of them out there. In fact, I don't really see any out there that have had the teardown done to it or anything, and I'm talking about the original PlayStation prototype controller. There are some images out there of it, but today we're actually taking one apart. And for this, I have to give a big shout out and thanks to Shamsa, who's been a longtime supporter of the channel, who reached out and asked if I wanted to take a look at one. And I also have to give a shout out to Vandals Gaming, who made this all possible as well. So we're going to be taking one of these things apart. And for the people out there who are collectors, of course, who might be having a hard time watching, cringing here and there at the thing coming apart, just know I was very careful and it all went back together. No problems at all there. So without further ado, let's take apart the original PlayStation controller. So if you guys enjoy the video, make sure to like button and subscribe if you're new. If you're unaware for whatever reason, I'll give you a quick rundown of what happened between Sony and Nintendo in the late 80s and the early 90s. They were collaborating on a CD attachment for the Super Nintendo, and it seemed that Nintendo didn't like how comfortable Sony was getting with the software that was going to be sold for that attachment. In fact, it appeared that Sony was going to have like complete control over it, or majority control, and instead Nintendo decided to pivot without telling Sony and announce that they were working with Philips, even though Sony had shown up to a big trade show to talk about this attachment. And after this happened, it appeared Sony was not happy, as you would expect, and that's all Ken Kutaragi needed to convince the higher-ups within Sony to make a big push themselves into gaming, and really that's what spurned on the PlayStation, and well, the rest is history. But of course, this didn't come together overnight, as there are a lot of things you have to do behind the scenes, especially if you're brand new on the market, as Sony was at that time, whether it's partnerships, different funding with studios, and just creating the hardware itself, which means you're going to go through a lot of prototypes with the system and controller. However, eventually you get to the point where you have to ship out development kits and at least some sort of input device to use with it, and that is where this controller comes in. Now, there have been some instances where this controller has popped up online, places like eBay, for example, and this is the model number DTL-H500C. There's also an image currently of this out there, I guess, where Sony was showing it off, where it had the symbols and kind of how they envisioned it, maybe if it was actually shipping to consumers, with your typical symbols for the Sony PlayStation and what looked like minus and plus. That's kind of interesting. Anyway, we could take a look at the controller that I have here, and the shape immediately looks to me like an upside-down Super Nintendo controller, and you have to remember, at this time, that was like the really popular system, Nintendo's latest device, and the controller was a really good controller. Even now, you can look at it and say, okay, that makes sense to me. That's a video game controller. It's very comfortable to hold. And it seemed like Sony looked at it and said, well, let's kind of develop something like that. But then they also noticed that the added inputs of the 6-button controller for the Genesis worked really well with certain games. So it seemed like they kind of mashed those together. And well, you can sort of see here, we have 4 main face buttons and then 2 other face buttons that are just off-center from being really perfect rows. I don't know if they were trying to make it so it kind of curves down and around, sort of, but because of this, it also has offset, start, and select buttons, which is very awkward to press, as you can imagine, I'm sure. The D-pad slopes to the center from all 4 points, and it is kind of odd to press. I think the idea is you'd be able to tell exactly where you are on that D-pad because it's so pronounced with how far those edges jut upwards, but I think they made the right decision when they pivoted and did what they ended up doing with the original PlayStation. In fact, I would say the same for the face buttons because they still retained the same number of inputs. They just moved those 2 bottom buttons to the top, as in your shoulder buttons, L1, L2, R1, R2. Makes a lot of sense there, considering you can press R2 and L2 at the same time with your index fingers, as opposed to having to choose which one of those face buttons to press with your thumb. Speaking of which, they did retain those shoulder buttons at the top that you would know from the Super Nintendo. And there is an interesting twist on these buttons here that we'll get into as we do the teardown, which on the back, we can see Phillips head screws holding this together. You're not really going to see too much when it comes to the engineering of this controller internally, as you can kind of see it's a very basic looking controller inside with the circuit board, because remember, this was a time where their designs were still very malleable and they were trying to figure out what the best setup would be for their input device, but they still needed games to get going when it comes to development. So this one in particular was used in a prototype, like the original prototype PlayStation system, and you can kind of see that through the 9-pin input on the end of the connector there, which also means that I don't really have anything for this controller to plug into, so I really haven't been able to use it in action. With those Phillips head screws removed from the back, the plastic comes off, and something I noticed immediately that I thought was kind of an interesting idea, where with the shoulder buttons, there's actually 2 points that you can press to register an input, and I think this is a great idea considering with something like the Super Nintendo that, again, Sony was clearly playing off of. It had one input directly in the middle, which means if you're not pressing around that area, it's not necessarily going to register on either of the edges. But it's different here because of these 2 larger points that you press. It seems to register across the board, at least as best as I can tell, because you do still get a click when you press down that shoulder button, even right on the edge. So this is a pretty cool idea from Sony. Unfortunately, they didn't really go this route with the PS1 because they did kind of make those shoulder buttons a bit narrow, which sort of means this part was unnecessary. The other big thing I noticed was the D-pad. So we already kind of discussed on the other side where you'd be pressing it, it juts out and up from the center. Well, on the inside, it doesn't have one of those pivot points. In fact, it's completely flat, which as soon as I saw that, I was thinking, okay, that looks like a terrible experience, because if you don't have that pivot point, you're going to have all these false presses. Maybe when you're playing a fighting game like Street Fighter, for example, and you have to rotate the D-pad around, it's just going to press everything at once. But this one doesn't do that. So I checked the back plastic and realized Sony decided to put the pivot point on the back of it. I've never seen this before, and it was a very interesting idea that I guess they didn't go with, but essentially it goes through the board, contacts the back of that D-pad with the little nub, and then you do kind of get that pivot point. And in fact, the D-pad can sort of float a bit on top of that because it's not necessarily attached to the bottom of the D-pad. Now, that's, I assume, the reason they didn't go this route, because of that floating nature to it, but it's definitely an interesting solution to maybe a design dilemma that they had as they were trying to figure out these different prototype controllers. Otherwise, inside of the controller, it definitely looks like you'd say a prototype, where some of the stuff sort of looks hand soldered at times, and it's definitely a work in progress for them. But I think just this piece of history with Sony is very interesting, because this is legitimately the start of PlayStation, this controller. Clearly, it changed a lot when they went to that PlayStation system. Really, if you think about it, they refined the Super Nintendo controller with its layout better than Nintendo did. Really, Sony moved 2 buttons up to the shoulder, so you had extra inputs, while keeping that standard like 4-button setup, D-pad, and then they added handles to it. Whereas Nintendo came up with the N64 controllers, but Nintendo also brought in the joystick that Sony eventually pivoted to themselves with the DualShock. So that's just kind of how it goes in gaming. It's just collaboration across the board without even actually talking to each other. Anyway, what I'll be doing is taking pictures of the internals here and posting them up online just so we have it out there, because I've legitimately not seen anything about the inside of this controller. And that's one of the reasons something like the D-pad and even the shoulder button setup caught me by surprise. So interesting stuff. You can always learn something new, I guess, even from hardware that's 30 plus years old now. But let me know what you guys think about this one down below. Once again, a big thank you to Shamsa for making this possible, and I'll see you guys next time.